Ethan Miller's life ran on a schedule so tight it barely left room to breathe. Every weekday morning began the same way. The alarm went off at 6:15 a.m. Not because Ethan needed that much time to get ready, but because Lily did. At 7 years old, she moved through mornings slowly, sleepy, stubborn, and easily distracted by the smallest things. A missing sock could derail the entire routine. A question about dinosaurs could turn brushing teeth into a 10-minute debate. Ethan never rushed her. He had learned that patience was cheaper than guilt. Their apartment was small, but lived in. Crayon drawings taped to the fridge, a couch with one arm slightly sagging, a faint smell of coffee that never quite went away. It wasn't the life Ethan imagined for himself in his 20s, but it was the one he'd built, carefully, deliberately, after everything else had fallen apart. He worked as a senior account manager at a mid-sized advertising agency downtown. The job paid well enough. The hours were long, meetings bled into emails, emails into late nights. His coworkers talked about work-life balance like it was a real thing, something you could schedule between calls. Ethan didn't laugh at the joke anymore. He just nodded and kept going. By the time he picked Lily up from after-school care each afternoon, his energy was already running low. But when she came flying toward him with her backpack half open and a story spilling out of her mouth, something in him always reset. He listened. He asked questions. He remembered details most people would forget. Neighbors knew him as the single dad on the fourth floor, the one who held the elevator, the one who apologized when Lily laughed too loudly in the hallway, the one who never brought anyone home. And that part was intentional. Ethan didn't date, not really. It wasn't that he didn't miss companionship. He did in quiet moments late at night when the apartment felt too still. But love felt risky now, not just for him, but for Lily. Letting someone in meant letting them into her world too, and that wasn't a gamble he took lightly. So his life stayed small, predictable, safe. Until one evening, as he tucked Lily into bed and turned off the light, she asked, half asleep, "Daddy, are you lonely?" The question landed heavier than she meant it to. Ethan stood there for a moment, hand on the doorframe, searching for an answer simple enough for a child and honest enough for himself. "No," he said finally gently, "I'm okay." And most days he believed that. Claire Bennett lived 2 doors down from Ethan in 4C. For almost a year, that fact meant very little. She was someone he passed in the hallway once or twice a week. Polite, composed, always moving with purpose. She dressed like she had somewhere important to be, even on weekends. Tailored coats in winter, clean sneakers, not gym-worn ones. Her hair usually pulled back, neat and controlled, like the rest of her. Their interactions were brief and predictable. A nod by the mailboxes. "Morning. Hey." A comment about the elevator taking forever. That was it. But Claire noticed more than she let on. She noticed how Ethan always positioned himself slightly in front of Lily, in shared spaces, like a quiet shield. She noticed how he lowered his voice when Lily got excited, not to silence her, but to bring the moment back down gently. She noticed the exhaustion in his eyes, the steady, worn kind, the kind that didn't come from one bad night, but from years of responsibility stacked without relief. Once, late in the evening, Claire heard a child crying through the thin walls. Not loud, just tired. She heard Ethan's voice next, calm, reassuring, unhurried. No frustration, no sharp edges, just patience. It stayed with her longer than she expected. Claire ran her own consulting firm. Corporate strategy, high-level clients, clean lines, tight deadlines, controlled outcomes. Her life was organized, intentional, and emotionally contained. That had been a choice, one she'd learned to make the hard way. Men in her experience came with expectations, with noise, with complications. Ethan didn't try to be anything. He didn't flirt. He didn't linger. He didn't look at her like she owed him attention. If anything, he looked past her most days, focused on Lily, on getting through the next hour. And somehow, that made him stand out. Claire told herself he was just a neighbor, a kind one, a good father, nothing more. Still, when she saw his name printed on a wedding invitation left on the lobby table one afternoon, same date as one she'd already RSVP'd to, she paused longer than necessary. She didn't know why. She just knew that, for the first time, she was curious about the man who lived 2 doors down, and the life he never talked about. The wedding invitation sat on Ethan's kitchen counter for 3 days before he touched it again. Cream-colored envelope, thick paper, his name printed neatly on the front, like someone had assumed, without hesitation, that he would come. The groom was Mark Reynolds, his college roommate from freshman year. They hadn't talked much in the last few years. Life had pulled them in different directions, the way it always did. Still, Mark had remembered him. That counted for something. Ethan picked it up late Sunday night after Lily was asleep and the apartment had gone quiet. He read the details again. Early October, lakeside venue, Saturday afternoon. His first instinct was no. Weddings were complicated. Too many couples. Too many questions asked with polite smiles. Who are you seeing? Why didn't you bring anyone? And explaining again that he was a single dad usually shut conversations down in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. More than that, leaving Lily for an entire evening felt heavy. She'd be with a sitter she knew, someone kind and reliable. But Ethan still pictured the moment she'd ask, "You're leaving?" And the small pause before she said she was fine. He folded the invitation and set it down. The next morning, Lily found it while he was packing her lunch. "Is that a party?" she asked, peering at the envelope. "Kind of," Ethan said. "Do you have to wear a suit?" "Probably." She made a face. "That sounds boring." Ethan smiled, but something shifted. He realized he'd been saying no out of habit, out of caution, out of a life that had grown smaller without him fully noticing. That night, after Lily was in bed, he RSVP'd yes. He told himself it was just one afternoon, a few hours. He'd show up, congratulate his friend, eat a piece of cake, and leave early. No expectations, no complications. Still, as he marked the date on the calendar, a faint unease settled in his chest. Like the feeling you get right before a road curves sharply, and you can't yet see what's coming next. Ethan had no way of knowing that this decision, small, reluctant, almost accidental, was the first crack in a life built entirely on being careful. The venue sat right on the edge of the lake, all glass windows and pale wood, the kind of place that looked effortless and expensive at the same time. Ethan arrived a few minutes early, tugging at the collar of a suit he rarely wore. He checked his phone. No missed calls, no messages from the sitter. Lily was fine. She always was. Still, he carried that quiet tension with him as he stepped inside, like a weight he'd learned to ignore. The room buzzed with low conversation and soft music. Guests clustered in familiar groups, laughing easily, already comfortable. Ethan spotted a few faces from college and exchanged brief greetings, but he stayed near the edge of the room, a practiced observer. Weddings did that to him now. Made him feel like he was watching something through glass. Then he saw her. Claire stood near the bar, speaking with an older couple, a champagne flute resting loosely in her hand. For a moment, Ethan wasn't sure it was really her. This version of Claire felt different. Her hair down, softly styled, her dark red dress simple but striking. She looked relaxed in a way he'd never seen in the hallway, her posture open, her smile unguarded. Their eyes met. Claire's expression shifted. Surprise first, then recognition. She paused mid-sentence, just long enough to let the moment stretch. Ethan gave a small nod, instinctive. She returned it, subtle and knowing, before turning back to her conversation as if nothing had happened. But something had. Ethan's attention fractured after that. Conversations blurred into background noise. He caught glimpses of Claire moving through the room, laughing, listening, fully present. This wasn't the quiet woman who slipped past him in the hallway with her keys already in hand. This was someone else entirely. And it unsettled him. As guests were guided toward their seats for the ceremony, Ethan found his place and felt a jolt when he realized the chair beside him was empty. A second later, Claire appeared, smoothing her dress as she sat down next to him. "Well," she said softly, a hint of amusement in her voice. "This is unexpected." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing." Around them, the music shifted. People stood. The ceremony was about to begin. Ethan faced forward, telling himself to focus, to stay grounded, to remember why he was here. But beside him, Claire sat close enough that he could sense her presence, steady and warm. And for the first time that evening, Ethan felt like the careful distance he'd built around his life was starting to thin. Just a little. The lights dimmed as the ceremony began, and a hush settled over the room. Soft strings filled the space, gentle and measured, the kind of music that made people instinctively sit a little straighter. Ethan watched the wedding party make their way down the aisle. bridesmaids in pale green dresses, groomsmen adjusting their jackets, all smiling with a mix of nerves and excitement. It was familiar, comforting, almost scripted. When the doors at the back opened and the bride appeared, the entire room stood. Ethan rose with everyone else, his hands folded loosely in front of him. He felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the strange mix of admiration and distance he always felt at weddings. Two people choosing each other so openly, so publicly. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. He focused on the bride's steady steps, on the way the groom's face softened when he saw her. Somewhere in his mind, a quiet thought surfaced. I don't live in moments like this anymore. Then Claire leaned closer. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Just enough that Ethan caught the warmth of her presence, the faint scent of her perfume. Something clean, understated. Her voice was low, calm, certain. Stop watching the bride, she whispered. Eyes on me. The words landed hard. Ethan turned his head without thinking. Claire was already looking at him, her expression steady, almost unreadable, but her eyes were clear, intentional, like she'd made a decision and was standing by it. For a split second, the world narrowed. The music faded, the guests disappeared. There was only the woman beside him and the sharp awareness of being seen, really seen, in a way he hadn't been in years. Not as a single dad, not as a responsibility, but as a man. Then Claire looked forward again, just as the officiant began to speak, as if nothing had happened. But for Ethan, everything had. He faced the altar, clapping when the room clapped, smiling when others smiled. Yet his heart was pounding, his thoughts tangled and loud. The ceremony unfolded, vows, rings, quiet laughter. But it all felt distant, like a scene playing behind glass. 6 words. That was all it took to crack the careful shell he'd built around his life. And Ethan knew, with a clarity that made him uneasy, that whatever happened next, there was no going back to the way things had been before. The applause faded into conversation as the ceremony ended, and the room slowly loosened. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. People leaned toward each other, whispering comments about the vows, the dress, the music. Ethan stood when everyone else did, clapping on instinct, though his mind was still somewhere else entirely. Claire didn't look at him right away. They moved with the crowd toward the cocktail area, standing close but not touching. Ethan was acutely aware of the space between them and of how deliberate it felt. He told himself to breathe, to reset, to remember why he was here. But the words she'd whispered kept replaying, steady and impossible to ignore. After a few minutes, Claire spoke again, casual this time. Do you want to step outside? It's quieter. He nodded before thinking too hard about it. The terrace overlooked the lake, the water dark and calm under string lights stretched between wooden posts. A cool breeze drifted in from the surface, carrying the faint smell of leaves and damp stone. Most guests stayed inside, clustered around drinks and small talk, leaving the space nearly empty. They walked a few steps in silence. I didn't plan that, Claire said finally, stopping near the railing. She rested her hands on the cold metal, staring out at the water. It just felt honest. Ethan let out a slow breath. I wasn't sure if I imagined it. She smiled faintly. You didn't. He hesitated, then said what had been pressing against his ribs all evening. I'm a single dad. Claire turned toward him, her expression attentive, not surprised. I know. That caught him off guard. You do? I see you with your daughter, she said simply, in the building. You're good with her. Something in her tone, calm, unjudging, eased the tension in his shoulders. Still, the words came out careful. My life is small, structured. I don't usually step outside of it. I figured, Claire said. Mine's controlled in a different way. She told him briefly about her work, about learning the hard way to protect her privacy, her trust. No dramatics, just facts shaped by experience. When she finished, they stood there again, the lake filling the quiet. I'm not asking for anything, Claire added softly. I just didn't want to leave tonight pretending I hadn't noticed you. Ethan looked at her then, really looked. The steadiness, the restraint, the risk in choosing honesty over comfort. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the urge to retreat. Thank you, he said. Claire nodded, as if that was enough for now. We should head back. They turned toward the doors together, the music from inside growing louder with each step. Nothing had been promised. Nothing had been defined. But something real had been acknowledged. And that, Ethan realized, might be the most dangerous and hopeful thing of all. The days after the wedding slid back into routine, but nothing felt quite the same. Ethan returned to early mornings and packed lunches, to deadlines and pickup times, to Lily's stories spilling out the moment she buckled into the car. On the surface, his life looked unchanged, but underneath it, something stayed awake, alert, quietly aware. He didn't see Claire right away. Monday passed without crossing paths. Tuesday too. By Wednesday evening, when Ethan checked the mail after dinner, she was already there, standing at the wall of metal boxes in dark slacks and a soft sweater. Hair pulled back the way he recognized. Familiar. Grounded. "Hey," she said, turning toward him. "Hey." They stood there for a beat longer than neighbors usually did. "Can we talk?" Claire asked. Ethan nodded. "Yeah." They kept it simple. Coffee the next night. No expectations, no labels. That became their rhythm. They talked after Lily went to bed, sitting across from each other on opposite ends of Claire's couch. Hands wrapped around mugs that went cold before either noticed. They talked about work, his agency chaos, her clients and constant negotiations, about exhaustion, about boundaries, about how both of them had built lives designed to hold everything together. Ethan was careful, deliberate. He didn't stay late. He didn't cross lines he wasn't ready to explain to his daughter. And Claire noticed. She respected it. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. They just sat, sharing space, the quiet unforced. That felt rare, valuable. In the building, they returned to being almost invisible. Polite hellos, neutral expressions, passing each other in the elevator without acknowledgement when someone else was present. It felt strange, like hiding something fragile instead of something wrong. Late one night, Claire texted him, "Are you awake?" Ethan stared at the screen longer than he should have. "Yeah," he replied. "Good, I just wanted to hear your voice." They didn't pretend anymore. Not with each other. But they didn't rush either. Both of them understood what was at stake. Ethan wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting Lily. And Claire wasn't just testing attraction. She was deciding whether she was ready to step into a life that already carried weight. Whatever this was, it wasn't reckless. It was intentional. And that made it feel far more real than anything Ethan had allowed himself to want in a very long time. It didn't take long for the outside world to notice the shift. Not because Ethan and Claire were careless, they weren't, but because routines have a way of revealing change. Ethan started lingering a little longer in the lobby some evenings. Claire's door opened more often after dark. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, just enough for people to notice what they wanted to notice. The building had opinions. A look held too long, a greeting that sounded more curious than friendly, someone on the elevator smiling like they knew something Ethan didn't feel ready to explain. He brushed it off at first. He'd learned as a single parent to tune out unnecessary noise. Claire couldn't ignore it as easily. A client canceled a meeting without rescheduling. Another asked, half joking, whether she was still fully focused on work these days. The comments were wrapped in politeness, but the message underneath was sharp and clear. Her personal life was becoming a point of interest, and not in a good way. She didn't tell Ethan right away. When she finally did, they were sitting at her kitchen counter late one night, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the fridge. "This is what I was afraid of," she said, not angry, just tired. People assume things. They fill in gaps with whatever story makes them comfortable. Ethan felt the weight settle in his chest. "If this is causing problems," she shook her head. "Don't finish that sentence." But the question hung there anyway. At the same time, Lily started asking more questions. Who was Claire? Why was Ethan smiling at his phone more? Children noticed changes even when adults tried to soften them. Ethan answered carefully, honestly, without offering more than Lily was ready to hear. The pressure came from all sides. Work, neighbors, expectations, unspoken rules about what a single dad should or shouldn't do. For the first time since the wedding, Ethan felt the familiar urge to retreat, to shrink his world again, to choose safety over connection. And Claire saw it. "We knew this wouldn't be easy," she said quietly one night. "The question is whether we stop now or decide it's worth the mess." Ethan didn't answer right away, but he knew the next choice they made wouldn't just change this. It would define what kind of life he was willing to live from here on out. The breaking point didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly on a Thursday night, when Claire showed up at Ethan's apartment later than usual. Her coat was still on. Her keys stayed in her hand. She didn't sit down. "I lost a client today," she said. Not bitter, not dramatic, just factual. Ethan felt the words land before he fully understood them. "Because of us?" Claire exhaled slowly. They didn't say it outright. They never do. But yes, someone saw us together, decided I was a risk. Silence filled the room. Lily was asleep down the hall, her nightlight casting a soft glow under the door. Ethan glanced toward it instinctively, the way he always did when things felt unstable. Claire noticed. "That's why I need to ask you something," she said gently. "And I need you to be honest." He looked back at her. "Okay, if this starts hurting your daughter, your job, your stability, do you walk away?" She paused. "From me." The question hit harder than anything before it. Ethan sat down slowly, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. For years, walking away had been his instinct. He'd built his entire life around minimizing risk, around making sure Lily never felt the ground shift beneath her feet. But sitting there, he realized something uncomfortable. Retreating didn't always mean protecting. Sometimes it meant teaching Lily that fear made decisions for you. That connection was something you abandoned the moment it got hard. "I've been thinking about that," he said finally, "about what I'm modeling for her." Claire didn't interrupt. "I don't want her to grow up thinking love is something you avoid to stay safe," he continued, "or that caring deeply is a mistake." He looked up at her then. "I don't want to walk away." Claire's eyes softened, but her voice stayed steady. "Even if it gets worse?" "Even then," he said, "as long as we're honest, as long as we're careful, but not hiding." She nodded once. Not relief, not celebration, just understanding. "Okay," she said quietly. "Then we keep going." Neither of them smiled, but something solid settled between them. Something heavier than hope, stronger than fear. A choice. And choices, Ethan knew, were what built real lives. Ethan didn't tell Lily right away. He took a few days to think through the words, the timing, the space he wanted to give her to react. Lily was perceptive in the way only children are. She noticed emotional shifts before adults learned how to name them. This wasn't something to rush. On Saturday morning, they sat at the small kitchen table, cereal bowls between them. Sunlight spilled through the window, catching dust in the air. Ordinary, safe. "There's someone I want you to meet," Ethan said carefully. "Her name is Claire." Lily looked up, spoon paused midair. "Like, a friend?" "Yes," he said, "someone important." She considered that, chewing slowly. "Is she nice?" Ethan smiled. "Very." They met at a park near the building later that afternoon. Claire arrived early, hands tucked into her jacket pockets, nervous in a way Ethan had never seen her before. When Lily ran ahead toward the swings, Claire stayed back, letting the space form naturally. "Hi, Lily," she said when Lily wandered over. "Your dad tells me you're really good at science." Lily brightened instantly. They talked about school, about dinosaurs, about the best playgrounds in the neighborhood. Claire didn't push. She listened. She followed Lily's lead. When Lily finally grabbed Ethan's hand and whispered, "She's okay," something in his chest loosened. Choosing to be seen didn't stop there. They stopped pretending in the building, rode the elevator together, spoke normally at the mailboxes. When a neighbor raised an eyebrow, Ethan didn't look away. At work, whispers followed him. Some subtle, some less so. He corrected what mattered, ignored what didn't. Claire did the same, setting firmer boundaries, owning her choices without apology. It wasn't easier, but it was clearer. For the first time in years, Ethan felt aligned. With his life, his values, the example he was setting for his daughter. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was standing in the open, accepting whatever came next, and trusting that the truth shared openly was stronger than fear ever had been. The problem wasn't the rent at first. It was the tone. Ethan's landlord didn't raise his voice or make threats. He smiled too much, spoke in vague phrases about market adjustments and new standards for the building. But the message underneath was clear enough. The rent would go up in 3 months, far more than Ethan could reasonably manage on one income. Ethan sat with the notice on the kitchen counter long after Lily had gone to bed, running numbers he already knew wouldn't work. He could cut back. He always did. But this time, cutting back meant changing Lily's school, her routines, the fragile stability he'd worked so hard to protect. When he told Claire, she didn't hesitate. "Move in with me," she said. The word stunned him. Not because they were reckless, but because they weren't. You're already there most nights, she continued gently. And I don't mean this as fixing something. I mean it as choosing something. Together. Ethan hesitated. Pride flared first. He didn't want to feel like he was being rescued. He didn't want Lily to think they were dependent on anyone else. Claire saw it all cross his face. This wouldn't make you less capable, she said. It would make us a family. That word settled slowly. They talked it through. Logistics, boundaries, space, Lily's room, school mornings, quiet time. Everything that mattered. Nothing rushed. Nothing assumed. When Ethan finally asked Lily how she felt, she surprised him. Does that mean I get to keep my friends and see Claire more? She asked. Yes. Lily nodded, satisfied. Okay then. Moving day was messy and exhausting. Boxes everywhere, shoes in the wrong places. Lily's drawings taped to new walls. That night they ate pizza on the floor, surrounded by half-unpacked life. It wasn't perfect, but as Ethan watched Lily laugh with Claire over a spilled soda, he realized something fundamental had shifted. Home was no longer a place he was trying to hold together alone. It was something they were building, intentionally, imperfectly, and together. Life didn't settle into perfection after that. It settled into reality. Mornings were louder now. Someone always forgot where they left their shoes. Lily complained about oatmeal but ate it anyway. Ethan learned that Claire liked the thermostat colder than he did, and Claire learned that Ethan never remembered to put the lid back on the toothpaste. They argued about dishes, about schedules, about nothing that really mattered, and then they learned how to stop, breathe, and talk it through. What surprised Ethan most wasn't how hard it was. It was how right it felt. On Sunday mornings, they walked to the small coffee shop down the street, Lily skipping ahead, already planning what pastry she wanted. Claire held Ethan's hand without thinking about who might see. When neighbors watched, she didn't flinch. When work got complicated again, as it always did, she faced it head-on, steadier than before. One evening, months later, they returned from the park as the sun dipped low, painting the building in soft gold. Lily ran ahead to the door laughing, her jacket half-zipped. Claire glanced at Ethan. Do you ever think about that wedding? He smiled. All the time. Me too, she said. I almost didn't say anything. Ethan stopped walking. Why did you? Claire thought for a moment. Because I was tired of being careful in ways that kept me alone. Ethan nodded. He understood that now. That night after Lily fell asleep, they lay in bed listening to the city outside. The distant hum of traffic, a siren far away, someone laughing on the sidewalk below. Ordinary sounds. A full life continuing. Are you happy? Claire asked quietly. Ethan didn't answer right away. He thought about the fear he'd carried for years, the way he'd shrunk his world to keep Lily safe, the risk he'd finally taken, not despite being a father, but because he wanted to show her what courage looked like. Yes, he said, I really am. Claire smiled and rested her head on his chest. Ethan stared at the ceiling, thinking about how everything had started with 6 unexpected words whispered during someone else's ceremony. Not fate, not magic. Just 2 people choosing honesty over silence. And maybe that's the real question this story leaves us with. How many times have we looked away from something meaningful because it felt safer not to choose? What would happen if we let ourselves be seen, just once? And who might be waiting on the other side of that risk? If this story moved you, if you saw yourself in Ethan, in Claire, or even in Lily, subscribe to the channel for more real, human stories about love, family, and the courage it takes to choose connection over fear. Because sometimes the most life-changing moments don't come with grand gestures. Sometimes they begin with a quiet decision to look up and keep your eyes open.